Well, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all here today. We appreciate the opportunity. I'll just tell you quickly about myself, and then Ron will, and then we will share screen and start our presentation. So, again, my name is Nancy Marchand-Martella. I have been a behavior analyst since I was just thinking about this 1987. I am a board certified behavior analyst at the doctoral level. I am just going back into teaching, having served as provost at the University of Colorado,
Yes.
Colorado Springs. I
So
was
I
a
think Marisol is ready, Susan is ready, Byron.
and I was a dean at Purdue University in West Lafayette, the College of Education. Before that, a department chair at the University of Oklahoma. But Ron and I spent the majority of our career at a regional comprehensive university, Eastern Washington University, where we taught courses in behavior analysis, special education, and so forth. We do have two children, one daughter who's a cognitive psychologist, interestingly enough, as being raised by two behaviorists, and then a son who's an instructional designer and film editor at the University of Northern Colorado. She's at the University of Georgia. And so, yeah, that's we use behavioral procedures in raising both of our kids, and it worked out pretty darn well, I believe. So I'll go ahead and introduce Ron.
Yeah, I'm Ron Martella, and pretty much everything Nancy said. We met 40 years ago now in a behavior analysis program. And I wanted in this presentation, we're going to go through some misconceptions, a lot of it, and then how behaviorists really look at learning and human behavior. A lot of misconceptions out there about it. Then we're going to move into how we look at instruction and briefly assessment after that. So we have a lot to go through, but realize that this is from our own experiences. We're not necessarily talking for every behaviorist out there, but it's based on our 40 years of experience being behavior analysts. We've worked with eating disorders, with traumatic brain injuries, with typical kids. We've worked in inner city Philadelphia with kids with severe emotional disturbances and so on. So we have a pretty wide range of experiences working in the field with students with severe needs and students without severe needs. We also have experience working in educational reform efforts like what's called school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports, response to intervention, and multi-tiered system of support. So we've been in the field long enough to have seen a lot of changes that have occurred, a lot of good changes that have occurred because of the work that both cognitivists and behaviorists have done and conducted over the last 40 years. I want to go ahead and share the screen here. So hold on one second. And we're going to move this. Oh, I get that out of the way. Okay. So Nancy's going to talk about what the learning objectives are for this talk.
Yeah, so the title, we can go back, Ron, real quick. Okay, so the title of our presentation is Behaviorism, Myths, Misconceptions, and Applications to Student Learning and Assessment. All right, so the student learning outcomes that we're going to be covering in today's presentation include the following. Describe at least 3 misconceptions of behaviorism and why are they wrong. Be looking for us to talk about that. Compare and contrast the behavioral and cognitive views of causal variables. Name the 3 forces of behavior from a behavioral view. Explain how behaviorism is similar to evolutionary biology, but on a much smaller scale. Describe at least 3 classroom applications that result from a behavioral perspective of student learning.
All right, so let's first start with 1953, The Science of Human Behavior textbook that B.F. Skinner wrote. And really, this presentation is going to be based off of that particular source and since that point for the last 70 years. I'm going to real quickly here. So here are aspects from behavior analysis. Humans are active. We emit behaviors. When a behavior is emitted, it has consequences. And these consequences may either increase, that's called a reinforcer, or decrease, punisher, the behavior in the future. So when we talk about reinforcement, realize we're not talking about necessarily rewards. There's a difference. A lot of people confuse the two terms. Rewards are things that we give individuals that may or may not increase the likelihood of the behavior. If the behavior does increase in the presence of the presentation of a stimulus, that is a reinforcer. In fact, that would be called a positive reinforcer. And if the behavior decreases in the presence of that stimulus, that would be defined as a positive punisher. So we use operational definitions of what a reinforcer and punisher is based on whether something's provided or taken away and whether the behavior increases or decreases in the future. The consequences are then determined by the person's physical and social environments. So we learn. So our behaviors then, from a behavioral perspective, are based on a couple of things. One is our current learning experiences and our past learning experiences. And that determines whether or not we're going to behave in a certain way in the future. This is the basic three-term contingency. It gets more complex than this. Everyone, if you take an intro to psych course or an educational psych course or an intro to behavior analysis course, you'll get the three-term contingency. We, again, can go much more complex into this. We can go into the fourth term contingency or fifth term. Many times we do talk about the fourth term contingency, which means that there's another variable right here that occurs before this initial stimulus. But the three-term contingency is first we have a discriminating stimulus. That's called an SD, a discriminated stimulus. We have the response, and then we have a particular reinforcer. Now, I want to point out something, again, in terms of the distinction between a reinforcer and a reward. A reinforcer can be anything, meaning I've worked with parents who use a spanking, for example, for a misbehavior, and you see the misbehavior increase. By definition, that spanking is a positive reinforcer. Positive doesn't mean good, and negative doesn't mean bad in our terminology. So if I see a parent spanking a child and the misbehavior increases, I'm going to assume that spanking then may be functioning as a positive reinforcer. It's counterintuitive to the way most of us learn in terms of our common vernacular. But it's a positive reinforcer simply because I'm providing a stimulus of spanking, and the behavior that is contingent upon that increases in likelihood. So therefore, it's a reinforcer. So here are some misconceptions of behaviorism or operant conditioning. First, a lot of people call this SR psychology. When we were in our doctoral program, we had other doctoral students talking about SR psychology and how behaviors were SR psychologists. It's not true. This is SR psychology. So a lot of you are familiar with Pavlov and Pavlov's dog. So classical respondent conditioning, you have a stimulus and then you have a response. That's SR psychology. We're talking about something quite different than that. Non-technically speaking, this would be a behavior that would be more of a reflex type of behavior and an involuntary response. So for example, we have an unconditioned stimulus, light in your eye, and then you have a pupil constriction. That would be an unconditioned response. And then over a time of pairing, if I turn on the light switch before the light hits your eye, you may have a pupil constriction. That is called a conditioned response. Notice this is a lot different than saying, read the word example, and the child says example. That's not a reflex. So what we're talking about is not SR psychology at all. We're talking about SRS psychology, if we want to categorize it as anything. So we are not SR psychologists. Nothing wrong with that. A lot of our behaviors are due to respondent conditioning. A lot of our emotional responses are due to respondent conditioning. But we're talking about something quite different than that. Again, non-technically speaking, we'd be calling that a voluntary type of response. Another misconception is that it is abusive or we overuse punishment. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nancy said we're both doctoral level behavior analysts, and we have to go through continuing ed credits every single year, every couple years on ethics. And one of the things about ethics is you don't want to use punishment unless you absolutely have to. We try not to use punishment if at all possible. In fact, we have techniques that tries to avoid the use of punishment. So this is from Skinner, what he said back in 1953. Civilized man has made some progress in turning from punishment to alternative forms of control. We are still a long way from exploiting the alternatives, and we are not likely to make any real advance so long as our information about punishment and the alternatives to punishment remains at the level of casual observation. As a consistent picture of the extremely complex consequences of punishment emerges from analytical research, we may gain the confidence and skill needed to design alternative procedures in the clinic, in education, in industry, and in other practical fields. Skinner's life work was trying to turn away from punishment, use it as minimally as we possibly can. So it's not true that we overuse punishment, we use it to a large extent. We do everything we can not to use punishment. That's a misconception. This is a big one, and a lot of people have been exposed to this. Rumors about Skinner and his daughter. He invented a thing called the baby tender, or commonly called the air crib. And it was basically a self-contained crib for children to sleep in, just like any other crib. But it has certain features that were found to be quite positive for the child. If you're interested in it, I'd look it up. It's actually quite fascinating about the invention of this particular type of crib. There was no chance for suffocation of the baby because the mattress was porous, so air would come up through the mattress. It was self-contained, so it had warm air, so you didn't need a lot of blankets and clothing on the child to keep warm and so on. So there was a lot of rumors about this, and in fact, some of the rumors were that Skinner raised his daughter in a Skinner box and she went crazy and killed herself. In fact, that's been repeated in a lot of classes, and it's created a lot of bias against behaviorism, unfortunately. My daughter, who we said was a cognitive psychologist, in one of her graduate level courses, a professor came in and talked about how evil Skinner was and how he raised his daughter in a Skinner box and did experiments on her, and she went crazy and killed herself. My daughter raised her hand because she knew that that wasn't the truth and said, "Excuse me, but that's not the truth." So the professor at the break time went and did a little Google search and found out that, in fact, that story was false. But he still came back and said, "Well, that may be true, but I still don't like Skinner." My son, who's in film, interestingly, had a film professor come in and talk about Skinner, how he raised his daughter in a Skinner box and did experiments on her. His daughter, according to this professor, was an actress. Maybe that's why he presented this to this class, in a film class, and how this actress went crazy and killed herself. Well, the problem with that is a couple problems. One, that wasn't true, that he didn't raise her in a Skinner box and did experiments on her and she killed herself. But the second problem was that she wasn't an actress. He confused the stories with John B. Watson, whose granddaughter was Marriott Hartley, who was an actress. So he kind of conflated two different stories together to create this myth about behaviorism and behaviorists. This is just an article that came out. There was a book that came out talking about Skinner that repeated this lie over and over again. And this says, a new book has rekindled old rumors that renowned psychologist B.F. Skinner used his baby daughter in his experiments. Stop this rubbish about me and my dad, says Deborah Skinny Buzan. So she wrote several articles talking about that she had a wonderful childhood, and all of these stories were absolutely false about him. But it's still occurring. Like I said, my kids, not long ago, just a few years ago, a couple of years ago, got the same story from their faculty members. So we are dealing with a lot of bias against behaviorists and what we do that simply aren't true. Does not consider or address motivation. And Jarek had an article that came out and he was criticized about motivation. And that's one of the reasons why we're here. We were interested in that article and contacted him about the issue about motivation. We do, in fact, consider motivation. Absolutely untrue that we do not. We do it differently, though. So this is from Skinner. We can easily invent explanations. We try not to invent explanations. We talk about things that we see, not things that we infer. We can say that some students study because they have a desire to learn, an inner urge to know, an inquisitive appetite, a love of wisdom, a natural curiosity, or some other trait of character. We thus allay our natural curiosity and satisfy our urge to know. We do not improve teaching, for nothing about a trait tells us how to alter it or even to keep it alive. We do look at motivation, but it's based on environmental variables, both internal environments, physiology, and external environments. So one example is some people have heard of the Premack principle. It's a description of how a reinforcer becomes a reinforcer. And this has also been called, in lay terms, grandma's rule. You know, you eat your vegetables, you can have dessert. But what this says is a high probability, and this has been validated through empirical research. We can use a high probability behavior, something that's likely to occur, to reinforce a low probability behavior. And the old experiments were to teach a rat, for example, put on a deprivation schedule of, let's say, 24-hour no drinking. The rat becomes thirsty. The rat has to run on the wheel in order to get access to the water. Same thing with having your child eat vegetables in order to get dessert. We have the individual engage in the low probability behavior in order to get access to the high probability behavior. That's one explanation of why a reinforcer is a reinforcer. That's where the motivation comes from. There's another one called the response deprivation hypothesis. It's not talked about as much, but I love this one because this actually has a lot of utility in classrooms. I don't have time to go into, but we use this quite a bit in classrooms. Here, if we limit a behavior below its baseline level, behaviors generally occur at some baseline level. If you can reduce the behavior below its baseline level, the behavior will increase in value as a reinforcer. So any behavior that you see that's occurring, if I can decrease that below its baseline level, that behavior then will become a reinforcer. The access to that behavior will be reinforcing. So theoretically, and this has been empirically validated, we could use a low probability behavior that could reinforce a high probability behavior. Theoretically, I could get the child to eat more dessert in order to get access to the vegetables, if vegetables in fact eating vegetables occur at some baseline level. This has been empirically validated, for example, with the rat with the drinking. What you do is you lock the wheel running and you deprive the rat of running on the wheel, which increases running on the wheel as a reinforcer to drinking more water. You can more than double the daily intake of a rat drinking water in order to get access to the running on the wheel. So it flips the response deprivation, the Premack principle on its head. We also talk about what's called motivating operations. This is, again, a very well-developed field in behavior analysis in terms of motivations. People just don't know about it or talk about it. So motivating operations have two effects. One is called value altering effects. So an increase in the reinforcing effectiveness of some stimulus, object, or event is a motivating operation. Technically, then, that is called an establishing operation, an EO. So if I am deprived of water, water becomes more reinforcing for me, more valuable for me. Therefore, water in this case, there's a motivating operation, which is a deprivation of water, and it increases its likelihood as a reinforcer. In other words, then water becomes an EO. It's an establishing operation, or the lack of water becomes an EO, an establishing operation. So a deprivation state, then that goes back to the response deprivation hypothesis. A deprivation of something increases its value as a reinforcer. You don't have anything to eat all day, food becomes more powerful of a reinforcer. That's a motivating operation. A decrease in the reinforcing effectiveness of something, a stimulus or object or event, is called an abolishing operation, an AO, abolishing operation. So if I've had this really large meal, food becomes less reinforcing for me. That's an abolishing operation. We would call that satiation. So once I become satiated on something, that something loses its value as a reinforcer. So motivating operation one has value altering effects. And second, it has behavior altering effects. So if I haven't eaten in a long time, food becomes more valuable to me as a reinforcer. And if I get access to that food, that behavior then that gets me access to that food increases in probability. So when I'm deprived of something, the behavior that I engage in that gets me access to that something, to that food, increases in likelihood. That's called an evocative effect. And the opposite is true too. If it's been a long time since I've eaten something, food is no longer reinforcing for me. The behavior of seeking out food diminishes, it decreases. That's called an ablative effect. So you see, this is pretty technical stuff. I mean, it would take many classes to go through all the different types of motivating operations, but it's a pretty well-developed field. It's not that we totally discount motivation. We look at it differently. So it goes in this way then, and again, we don't have time to go into all of these, but I just wanted to show you the complexity of this. So we have motivating operations, two types. Unconditioned, that's physiological. So if I haven't had anything to drink all day long and I become thirsty, that's an unconditioned motivating operation. It's physiological. And conditioned motivating operations. So like praise, points, grades. Those are all conditioned motivating operations. So if I haven't had praise from a friend for a long period of time, the praise from my friend may increase in likelihood as a reinforcer. Okay. And then under conditioned motivating operations, you've got surrogate, reflexive, and transitive. Again, it's a pretty well thought out field in terms of what motivates. The difference is it's not mental, it's not mentalistic, it's environmentally based and physiologically based on what are motivating, what's not. Only works with animals. It does work with animals quite well. It's effective with animals. Behaviorism had a profound effect on animal training. Clicker training was developed by Karen Pryor when she was hired to work with dolphins to train them to look for mines in the ocean. She developed clicker training. It's used across the world. It's probably the #1 method of training animals in zoos now across the world. It's all based on behavioral principles that Skinner set out in 1953. But it's also effective with humans. And I listed a number of areas where behavior analysis leads the field in terms of treatments. Autism, especially in language acquisition, early and intensive behavioral interventions, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, medication along with behavior modification or scientifically based procedures. Behavior disorders, applied behavior analysis, positive behavior supports, functional analysis, all come from the behavioral realm. Intellectual and developmental disabilities, applied behavior analysis, task analysis. Learning disabilities and dyslexia, explicit and systematic instruction. Behavior management, applied behavior analysis, positive behavior supports. These are all research-based, scientifically based approaches that are considered state-of-the-art. Mental health issues, behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. And behaviorally oriented educators have also been instrumental in the development of educational reform initiatives, such as response to intervention, school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports, like I mentioned, and multi-tiered systems of supports. So it doesn't only work with animals. We do not consider what goes on inside the head. Not true. We treat it differently. So let's look at the difference. So if we look at it in terms of scientific terminology, again, we look at the three-term contingency, the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence, which I talked about before. Cognitivists would consider the antecedents and consequences as independent variables, but I would look at these as little I, little v. What goes on around you is important. What the antecedent is important. If I show you the word example, that's my antecedent. It's important whether or not you read that word. And if you read the word correctly and I praise you and say, that's right, that word is example, you're more likely to say that word again correctly the next time it's exposed to you. The dependent variable is the behavior. So if I show you the word example and you say example, that's my behavior, then I praise you. You're more likely to say example in the presence of example. But from the cognitivists, there's something else that's going on inside the head that's called cognitions. This takes on a priority, most important variable here, and that's what is going on inside the head. It's causal in nature. So we have the stimulus, the antecedent that goes inside the head, and then somehow is transformed in some manner. Now, this makes a difference in how we treat, for example, dyslexia or a reading disorder. So let's focus in on that. So the predominant theory that goes on, what goes on inside the head is the information processing theory. So we have our stimuli there. This is our antecedent, enters into our sensory memory or sensory systems. Then we have attention. We have some type of transformation that takes place, moves into working memory. We have rehearsal, and then we move the information into long-term memory. It's a computer-based model, but it's causal in nature from a cognitive perspective. So let's say I have a student and I show the student the letter B, and the student reverses that and says that is a D. From a cognitive perspective, we would say there's some type of transformational perceptual problem going on inside the head. The problem is with that is we can't see that, measure it, or observe it. So cognitively, we would say there's something going on here that's creating the behavioral output that's incorrect. Behaviorists look at it differently. Not that we discount what's going on inside the head, we do not at all, but we look at it differently. We look at what goes on inside the head as a dependent variable. It's dependent upon our physiology, our internal environments, and our external environments. So we have the antecedent that creates internal behaviors. Neurons start firing. It's behavior. And then we have a behavioral output as well. So if I have a student who reverses letters, I'm not going to say there's a perceptual problem that I can't see. I'm going to say there's some type of stimulus error. The student is responding incorrectly to the visual stimulus. So our treatment here would be, it leads us directly to that, and that is to reteach it. So if you look at really good reading programs, for example, we can prevent a lot of those letter reversals by teaching appropriately. I would teach, for example, the letter D first. It's more frequent in the English language than the letter B. I would teach the letter D to mastery and separate the presentation of B much further down the road. I would separate them out so the students don't make the stimulus error, a discrimination error. I reteach the letter sounds and the letter names. Okay, so we don't discount what goes on inside the head at all. What goes on inside the head tells us something about your external environment and your internal environment. It tells us something about what your experiences are. We don't discount it, but we treat it differently. We try to stay away from then circular logic. Labels, for example, is circular logic. We try to stay away from that. So, for example, working in the field of special ed, we see this a lot. Let's say we have a child who is not learning how to read. And I go into the teacher and I say, why can't she learn how to read? And the teacher goes, well, because she has a learning disability. And I say, well, how do you know she has a learning disability? And the teacher's likely to say, because she's not learning how to read. It's a circular logic. It tells us absolutely nothing about what's going on or what to do to solve that problem. Behavior problems are the same way. Why is this little boy always getting into fights? Well, because he has a behavior disorder. How do we know? Because he's always getting into fights. ADHD is the same way. It's a label. Why can't this student maintain on-task behavior? Because he's got ADHD. How do we know? Because he can't maintain on-task behavior. The reasons for that are not the label. There are other reasons for that, maybe physiological, genetic, or environmental reasons, but it's not the label. The label tells us nothing about the cause. But here we run into this problem. This is from Piaget. So from Piaget's perspective, development explains learning. In other words, if I look at, for example, the pre-operational stage, I would say the reason why the child is able to develop language and use symbols and symbolic thinking and is egocentric is because the child is in the pre-operational stage. The reason why the kid can do this. Behaviorists flip that on its head. We're saying, no, that's not true. Pre-operational stage is defined by what the student is doing, therefore it cannot explain it. The reason why that student is in the pre-operational stage is because the student can do these things. Now, here's why this was important years ago. There's a thing called developmentally appropriate practice in reading. From a Piagetian perspective, we should not start teaching reading or exposing, is a better term, the child to reading until the concrete operational stage is 7 to 11 years of age, on average 9 years of age. I hope you don't start teaching reading at 9 years of age. It may be too late. We are now starting to teach reading, at least pre-reading skills in preschool for a good reason. Kids need to be at grade level reading by no later than 3rd grade. That's 9 years of age at grade level reading. So we look at it differently. The skills that we learn define what stage you're in, not the opposite way. Okay? So there are 3 forces in that really act on us. Mentalism isn't one of them, if you notice that. Physiology, culture, and past or immediate environment. Now, I want to point out, if we go in, I'm working in a school or I'm teaching my college class, I have absolutely no control over the student's physiology. I guess you could argue that if you're giving the kid medication or something like that, maybe you're trying to mess with the physiology. But we don't have any direct control over the child's physiology, nor would we necessarily want to. We have no control, or hopefully, we don't try to control a student's culture. We shouldn't and probably don't have control over the student's culture in a classroom. What we do have control over is the past or immediate environments. That's where we're focusing on in this talk then, the past or immediate environments. That's the focus. What can we do in a classroom that improves learning of the student? So I want to show one other thing here, and this is interesting to me because I've spent a lot of time researching this, reading a lot of biology, and then a lot of behaviorists who compare behaviorism and biology. And Skinner was heavily influenced by evolutionary biology and Darwin. We have what's called selection by consequences. That was a term coined by Skinner, selection by consequences. All forms of life, from single cells to complex cultures, evolve as a result of selection with respect to function. That's phylogeny, natural selection, and the evolution of a species. What we're talking about from a behavioral perspective is ontogeny. It operates during the lifetime of the individual. So from my perspective, really behaviorism is evolutionary biology on a much smaller scale. So here's an example with evolutionary biology, for example, with mutations. If I have a mutation and it does not allow for the survival of the species, the mutation dies out. The mutations that are selected for survive. We have a very similar thing in behavior analysis. This is the old cat in the box experiment by E.L. Thorndike. You put a cat in the box, it has a lever. If the cat hits the lever, it's able to get out. And what you notice is the amount of time it takes for the cat to figure out how to hit the lever. It takes a long time at the beginning, and gradually the amount of time in the box decreases until at some point the cat is put in the box and it immediately goes over and hits the lever. You notice there's a lot of behaviors here at the beginning. Those are like mutations that do not allow for the survival of the behavior. Those gradually extinguish. Notice we use the term extinguish, similar like the evolutionary biologists do. Those behaviors extinguish. They become less and less likely, and the behavior that allows for the cat to escape is strengthened. That's like a mutation that's strengthened. So it looks like this. In evolutionary biology, anything that allows you to adapt to your environment or the species to adapt to the environment survives. Anything that does not fails. That's called extinction. Behavior analysis, same way. Anything that allows for the survival is called reinforcement. A lack of reinforcement then is called extinction. There's a parallel between the two method. So really, I consider behavior analysis really as an applied form of biology, an applied biology, just on a much, much smaller scale.